The silence around the table was complete, heavy, suffocating, and somehow satisfying. My Aunt Patrice, a woman who normally filled every quiet second with criticism, stood frozen with her wine glass halfway to her lips, her trademark smirk collapsing into confusion. But she wasn't the person I was watching. My eyes were fixed on Mark, my cousin, an active-duty Navy SEAL trained to stay composed under fire, who now looked like he might be sick. He had turned completely pale, staring at me from across the centerpiece, as though I had suddenly transformed into a monster. His knuckles were white around his fork, locked in a posture of pure instinctive submission. I calmly cut into my steak, the knife giving a polite scrape against the china, and took one slow, deliberate bite. It was almost amusing how completely wrong Patrice had been. She had spent her whole life believing power was something visible, something that looked like bicep measurements, booming voices, and war stories delivered at maximum volume. She didn't understand that in the world I actually inhabited, real power is frighteningly quiet. It isn't the operator crashing through the door, it's the unseen hand directing them toward the building. Real power belongs to the person who signs the document authorizing the airstrike, the person who determines whether the weapon remains in the holster. She believed she was controlling the room, but she had no idea she was sitting across from the only person at that table who knew the clearance codes connected to her son's operation. To understand the terror in Mark's eyes, you have to understand the 2 hours that came before this moment. When I arrived for Thanksgiving, the house was already buzzing with the performative patriotism my family adored. Aunt Patrice was completely in her element, practically glowing with pride as she paraded Mark around in his dress whites. She introduced him to the neighbors as a hero, her voice rising with theatrical admiration. Then she reached me. She gestured toward me with a limp hand, introducing me to the family. And this is Lena, our little paper pusher in D.C. She's basically a secretary for the government. But hey, federal benefits, right? I felt that familiar cold weight settle inside my stomach, the internal tally adding another mark to the long list of disrespect. The breaking point came when she cornered me beside the drinks cart before dinner. I was simply trying to get a glass of water when she towered over me, smelling of Merlot and condescension. "You know, Lena," she said, her voice carrying easily above the jazz music, "it honestly frustrates me to see where our tax dollars go." She took a sip of wine, making sure Mark was watching her defend his honor. "We have heroes like Mark out there, doing the real work, sweating and bleeding, while bureaucrats like you just shuffle files in air-conditioned offices." I tried to deflect, giving my usual explanation about the sensitive nature of my department, but she interrupted me with a snort. "Oh, save it," she sneered. "That I can't talk about it routine is just a convenient excuse for being boring. Just admit it, you file receipts." I stared at her, truly stared at her, and realized she honestly believed I was nothing. She thought she could intimidate me because I didn't wear a uniform or carry a trident. Patrice believed she was mocking the black sheep. She had no idea she was insulting the shepherd who watched over the wolves. The dinner table had turned into a stage, and Aunt Patrice was the director, producer, and star of the entire performance. She entertained the family with exaggerated, cinematic stories about Mark's training, tales I knew for certain she had embellished, judging by the way Mark was currently examining his mashed potatoes as though they held an escape route. She talked about Hell Week and high-value targets with the breathless excitement of someone watching an action film, completely unaware of the quiet, grim reality of the man seated beside her. Whenever Mark attempted to offer a modest correction, she steamrolled straight over him, her voice climbing another octave to make sure the neighbors heard every detail about her warrior son. Then, inevitably, the spotlight turned toward me, but the lighting shifted from heroic gold to a pitying fluorescent gray. The story changed from the warrior to the spinster bureaucrat. Patrice looked at me with a sad, tight smile, the kind reserved for a child who has just dropped their ice cream cone into the dirt. She portrayed my life as a tragedy of fluorescent lights and endless spreadsheets, a lonely existence ruled by filing cabinets and government red tape. It must be so exhausting, dear, she sighed, refilling her wine glass. Staring at screens all day, dealing with all those forms. But at least you have good dental benefits. That's something to hold on to. I took a slow drink of water, allowing the cold liquid to steady me, while my thoughts drifted 3,000 miles away to the windowless concrete reality of the vault. Patrice believed I worked in a cubicle farm. In reality, I worked inside a sensitive compartmented information facility, or SIF, deep within the heart of Joint Special Operations Command. I wasn't a secretary, and I certainly didn't file receipts. I was a Level 5 targeting authorization officer. In the lethal ecosystem of modern warfare, I wasn't the trigger puller, I was the safety latch, the guidance system, and the judge. My job wasn't administration, it was the kill chain. While Mark and his team were the kinetic instrument, the hammer, I was the one who determined where the nail actually was. My days were spent analyzing pattern-of-life data, tracking the precise, habitual movements of some of the world's most dangerous men. I watched them sleep, eat, and meet with their lieutenants through high-altitude thermal feeds that transformed human beings into glowing white ghosts on a screen. I didn't merely organize files, I possessed absolute veto authority over strike packages. If I didn't see positive identification, or PID, that met the strict requirements of international law, the mission was a no-go, regardless of how desperately the operators on the ground wanted to breach the door. I remembered a night 6 months earlier, a memory that seemed a lifetime removed from this pumpkin pie and stuffing. I was sitting at my terminal at 0300 hours, surrounded by the low, uneasy hum of server banks and the scent of stale coffee. We were tracking a high-value target in a densely populated urban sector, a man responsible for 3 embassy bombings. The drone feed showed him entering a compound, but my examination of the thermal signatures revealed an inconsistency. There were too many heat signatures in the adjoining room, small, erratic heat patterns that matched the pattern of life for children, not combatants. A 3-star general was standing directly behind my chair, his breathing heavy with frustration and peppermint. He saw the target, he saw the window of opportunity narrowing. "Authorize the strike, Lieutenant," he had ordered, his voice leaving no space for argument. "We have the window. Drop the package." The room had become deathly silent. Every analyst, every comms officer froze, waiting for me to give in. In that moment, I wasn't a niece, or a daughter, or a paper pusher. I was the firewall between a successful operation and a war crime. "Negative, sir," I had replied, my voice steady, despite the adrenaline surging through my veins. "Collateral estimate exceeds the threshold. I am reading 4 civ packs in the blast radius. I am declaring a tactical abort under Rules of Engagement subsection 4. The general had slammed his hand onto my console, shouting that I was letting a monster escape, but I refused to sign the authorization. The strike was scrubbed. 2 hours later, ground assets confirmed that the civ packs were indeed the target's grandchildren. I hadn't simply completed paperwork that night. I had saved the souls of every man in that unit, including the general's career, by refusing to let them become killers. Snap back to the dinner table. Patrice was staring at me again, shaking her head with that unbearable performative sympathy. "I bet your wrist hurts from all that typing, doesn't it?" she asked, chuckling at her own joke. "Carpal tunnel is the silent killer of the administrative class." I smiled politely, carving a piece of turkey with surgical precision. I glanced at my wrist, the same wrist that had remained steady against the screaming of a 3-star general, the same hand whose signature was the difference between a predator drone hovering or striking. I had spent 10 years protecting men like Mark from bad intelligence and legal nightmares, but tonight, the only thing I needed to protect was my patience. Dinner arrived at the table, a sprawling feast of roasted turkey and glazed sides that looked flawless, but tasted like ash in my mouth. Aunt Patrice had progressed to her 3rd glass of Merlot, and the alcohol had dissolved whatever thin layer of social grace she normally maintained. She wasn't content with merely praising Mark anymore. She needed to raise him by standing on my throat. She leaned across the table, her eyes glittering with a cruel sort of amusement that made my stomach twist. "Mark," she slurred slightly, gesturing with her fork. "Tell Lena about that time you had to sleep in the mud for 3 days. In where was it? The jungle? Maybe then she'll appreciate her air-conditioned office and ergonomic chair a little more." Mark shifted in his chair, looking miserable. He was a warrior, yes, but he wasn't a bully, and watching his mother tear me down was clearly destroying his appetite. "Mom, don't," he muttered, keeping his gaze locked on his plate as though it held the secrets of the universe. "Lena's job is important too. It's government work, it matters." He was trying to be kind, trying to toss a bone to the poor dull cousin, but his defense was weak because he genuinely didn't know what I did. To him, I was simply a civilian with a security badge, someone who shuffled paper while he pushed boundaries. He gave me a sympathetic smile, the kind you give a child who tried their hardest but still failed. Patrice pounced on his hesitation like a shark catching the scent of blood in the water. "Important?" She scoffed, laughing loudly enough to startle everyone else at the table. "She files receipts, Mark. She organizes the office Christmas party. Come on, Lena, admit it." She pointed a manicured finger at me accusingly. "Your support staff, you're the background noise that real people overlook." Background noise? The words lingered in the air, vibrating with a decade of missed birthday calls, forgotten accomplishments, and the constant grinding belief that I was somehow secondary. I stared at her, and I remembered every time she'd cut me off, every time she'd looked beyond me to see whether someone more interesting was entering the room. I slowly lowered my fork, the metal clicking against the china with finality. I realized in that instant that arguing with her was pointless because she didn't speak the language of emotion. She only understood the language of hierarchy. If I attempted to explain my value, she would simply laugh. But Mark spoke another language. He spoke the language of clearance levels, call signs, and absolute authority. I looked at my cousin, completely unaware that he was sitting across from his boss's boss, and I felt a cold, steady focus wash over me. I decided right then to stop playing the niece and start playing the officer. I wasn't going to argue. I was going to give them exactly what they demanded. The truth distilled into the one precise frequency only a seal would recognize. She wanted to know where I belonged in the food chain, so I decided to show her that I wasn't part of the meal. I was the one holding the menu. Patrice leaned closer, her elbows planted on the table in a violation of the etiquette she normally valued so highly. She was searching for the kill shot, the final admission that my life was small, meaningless, and completely beneath the glorious shadow cast by her son. "Come on, Lena," she purred, her voice coated in faux intimacy. "We're all family here. You can be honest. All you do is paperwork, right? You shuffle forms from one stack to another until 5 o'clock hits. Just admit it so we can move on." I felt the eyes of everyone at the table fixed on me, waiting for the invisible child to retreat into the corner where she supposedly belonged. I took a slow, measured sip of my wine, allowing the silence to linger just long enough to become uncomfortable. "I don't file paperwork, Aunt Patrice," I said, my voice calm and completely free of the defensive edge she was hoping to provoke. "I oversee special missions. My primary function is ensuring strict compliance with international law and mission parameters during live operations." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. I spoke with the same flat, clinical tone I used when briefing the Joint Chiefs. Patrice threw her head back and laughed, a sharp, barking sound that grated against the crystal glasses. "Oh, listen to her," she crowed, wiping a tear of amusement from her eye. "Mission parameters. God, you watch too many movies. What do you think you're in the CIA or something? What's your fancy code name then? Agent Paperclip? Special Agent Stapler?" She glanced around the table, grinning, expecting everyone to laugh along and reward her cruelty. But nobody laughed. I didn't look at her. I shifted my attention directly to Mark. He was currently cutting a piece of ham, his expression locked into a polite, frozen smile as he tried to endure his mother's storm. I caught his gaze, holding it with an intensity that made him stop mid-cut. I needed him to understand that this conversation was no longer about family. It was about the chain of command. "I don't have a code name, Mark," I said softly but clearly. "But within the network, my routing signature is Ghost 90. The effect was immediate and brutal. It was as though I had reached across the table and slapped him. Mark froze. The fork fell from his fingers and struck his porcelain plate with a loud clatter, a sharp, jarring sound that reverberated through the sudden silence. The color didn't merely disappear from his face. It drained completely, leaving him pale, ashen, and visibly ill. To a civilian, Ghost 90 sounds like nonsense, a random combination of impressive-sounding words. But to a SEAL? To an operator in the field? Ghost 90 isn't a person. It's the ominous, disembodied voice from the tower, with the authority to cancel their air support, deny their extraction, or authorize the Hellfire missile that keeps them alive. It is the voice of God on the comms channel. Patrice, completely unaware that the air had just been sucked from the room, looked confused. She glanced from me to her frightened son, her brow tightening. "What?" she asked, her voice shrill with annoyance. "Ghost 90? That sounds stupid. Is that supposed to be scary?" Mark swallowed hard, his Adam's apple moving visibly in his throat. He looked at me, and for the first time in our lives, I didn't see a cousin or childhood playmate. I saw a subordinate staring at a superior officer. "Mom, stop," he whispered, his voice trembling in a way that frightened Patrice more than any shout could have. He turned toward her, his eyes wide and desperate. "You don't understand. Ghost 90 isn't an agent, Mom. It's an authority designator." He took a shaky breath, glancing back at me as though seeking permission to continue. "If she's Ghost 90, that means she's the one who authorizes my team's paychecks. She authorizes our gear, and she controls the extraction birds. Mom, she outranks my commander. She outranks everyone." The table fell completely silent. It was a thick, suffocating silence, the kind that normally follows a terrible car crash. Patrice stared from her son, the hero she had placed upon a pedestal, to me, the secretary she had spent decades mocking. Her mouth opened and closed, but no words emerged. She was trying to rebuild her worldview, trying to make the numbers add up, but the equation had fundamentally collapsed. The hierarchy she worshipped had just reversed itself in front of her salad plate. My aunt looked toward her son for rescue, but for the first time in his life, Mark wasn't looking at her. He was waiting for me to dismiss him. I slowly folded my linen napkin, setting it beside my half-eaten steak with deliberate, gentle precision. The sound of the fabric settling onto the table was soft, barely a whisper, yet in the suffocating void that had fallen over the dining room, it sounded like a gavel striking a judge's bench. I looked around the table one final time, taking in the scene not as a family gathering, but as an assessment of neutralized threats. Aunt Patrice was still staring at me, her mouth slightly parted, her eyes flicking between me and her son, as though desperately searching for the flaw in the reality she had built. She wanted to speak. I could see the muscles in her throat working, trying to produce some insult, some dismissal that would force me back into my box, but the words died before reaching her lips. She couldn't ridicule me anymore, because the source of her pride, her golden child, had just lowered his head to me. I pushed my chair backward, its legs scraping across the hardwood, and rose to my feet. I didn't hurry. I didn't look angry. I checked my watch, a simple tactical piece that Patrice had once called ugly and masculine, and tapped the face. "I have a briefing at 0800, I said, my voice slicing through the silence without rising even a decibel. "And given the current threat levels in the sector, I need to be sharp. Thank you for dinner, Aunt Patrice. The turkey was excellent." I turned my attention toward Mark. He was still sitting rigidly, his hands resting in his lap, stripped of all the bravado his mother had draped over him like a costume. "Mark," I said, meeting his eyes. "Good seeing you. Stay safe on your next rotation. Check your comms protocols before you